Jon Bunyan, Michelangelo, Anne Frank, and Jesse Owens. Some famous during their own lives and some long after their deaths. Though most never boasted of a career in ministry, their influence is undeniable. And a reminder to us all, in whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God, the Father, through him. We've all heard it said that life is a journey, and so it is with our own spiritual lives. Every step in our faith journey is filled with hardships and heartache, joy and celebration, purpose and promise, until we reach our ultimate heavenly destinations. Nearly 400 years ago, this journey of faith was brought to vivid life in the classic story, Pilgrim's Progress. In this month in history, August 31st, 1688, English author and pastor Jon Bunyan, perhaps one of the most influential writers who ever lived, completed his own spiritual journey, passing from this life to the next. Not much is known about Bunyan's early life, not even the date of his birth. But as he would probably agree, his real birth happened the day he received Christ, November of 1628. Though widely celebrated as one of the most influential Christian writers who ever lived, Bunyan spent many years in jail for committing religious crimes against the church. During this time, he wrote a spiritual autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, and began to work on one of the world's most famous books, The Pilgrim's Progress.
Jon Bunyan was the son of a traveling metalworker in England's agricultural Midlands. Bunyan's imagination was formed in his early days by popular adventure tales. His family were members of the Anglican Church, but he became familiar with the literature of the Puritans as well. Bunyan spent a particularly large amount of time in the Bible, specifically the authorized version by King James. In Bunyan's autobiography, he mentions dealing with troubling nightmares on a regular basis. His dreams were likely caused by his extreme sense of guilt that he carried. He even describes himself in childhood as being the very ringleader of all that kept me company into all manner of vice and ungodliness. In 1644, his mother and younger sister died. The English civil wars were in full swing, and Bunyan found himself enlisted in the parliamentary army, fighting against the royalists, those upholding the English monarchy. His time in the army did not last long, but Bunyan did experience an event that he later describes in his autobiography as evidence of the grace of God.
When I was a soldier, I with others were drawn out to go to such a place to besiege it. But when I was just ready to go, one of the company desired to go in my room, to which, when I had consented, he took my place. And coming to the siege, as he stood sentinel, he was shot into the head with a musket bullet and died.
Within 2 years of leaving the army, Bunyan married. Married life was hard for the young couple. Bunyan said in his autobiography that the couple had very little, not having so much household stuff as a dish or a spoon betwixt us both. The couple's first daughter, Mary, was born in 1650 and soon became blind. They would have 3 more children, Elizabeth, Thomas, and John. From his youth well into adulthood, Bunyan enjoyed playing games and dancing. He particularly liked a game called Tip Cat, which involved hitting a small piece of wood with a bat. He often played on Sunday, which was forbidden by the Puritans, who held that the Sabbath was only for concentrating on the Lord. No work or leisure activities were allowed.
The Puritans were in protest against the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, the official state church of the monarchy. The Puritans rejected the elaborate rituals, decoration, and hierarchy of the Anglican Church, which they considered too similar to the Roman Catholic Church. The Puritans sought to simplify religious practice and abandon traditions that were not grounded in Scripture. The term Puritan was originally an insult hurled at them by Anglicans who accused them of being too easily offended by Anglican practices and sought to purify the church of its evils. Puritans did not use the term to refer to themselves, primarily using saints instead. One Sunday afternoon, Bunyan was playing Tip Cat after just hearing a sermon that morning that warned against breaking the Sabbath. During his game, he claims to have heard a voice from the heavens say, "Wilt thou leave thy sins and go to heaven? Or have thy sins and go to hell?"
The next few years were a time of intense spiritual conflict for Bunyan. He struggled with his doubts and fear over religion and guilt over what he saw as his state of sin. Bunyan knew in his heart he was a sinner, but he also viewed the current state of the church as flawed, lacking a perfect representation of the Christ that they preached. He wasn't the only person who had reservations about the church as a whole, considering that entire wars were being fought on the subject. Bunyan was making ends meet as a traveling handyman, repairing pots and pans. While he was in Bedford, he overheard a group of women speaking on spiritual matters outside their home. The women were a few of the founding members of the Bedford Protestant Church. Bunyan was so impressed by their conversation that he joined their church. Members of the congregation began to insist on Bunyan leading sermons, and so giving in, he began to preach, not only at the church, but at small groups in the surrounding areas as well.
In 1658, Bunyan's wife died, leaving him with 4 small children, one of them blind. Though he was married 1 year later, this period of his life was marked by agonizing spiritual despair for several years. He was a tormented soul. He heard voices. In fact, according to Bunyan, these voices urged him to blaspheme the scriptures, which led to a large amount of spiritual guilt and a spiral of depression. But Bunyan overcame. Over time, he began to feel a release from the burden of sin. He saw the merits of grace and understood that the text of the Bible offered more than guilt and terror. The words of Scripture could bring life, joy, and peace. The English Civil Wars had failed to permanently overthrow the monarchy, and with it, the religious persecution of the state-controlled church. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Bunyan's ability to preach would be severely limited. In November 1660, Bunyan was warned of a warrant out for his arrest. He received the news while preaching. Bunyan chose not to evade capture. He was arrested and brought before Sir Francis Wingate, the local magistrate.
Under the Conventicle Act of 1593, he was charged with attending a religious gathering in excess of 5 non-family members, not officially sanctioned by the Church of England. The offense was punishable by 3 months in prison, and then banishment or execution if the person failed to give a commitment not to reoffend. In practice, the act was used rarely, but some speculate that Bunyan's arrest was probably due to the fear that Bunyan's meetings were a guise for secret plots to overthrow the king, which was not the case. So he was thrown in jail. In prison, Bunyan had 2 books, a Bible and John Fox's Book of Martyrs. It was in prison that Bunyan wrote his 2 famous works, Grace Abounding and The Pilgrim's Progress.
The hero of Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory about a young man named Christian, navigating the pathway to the celestial city, symbolizing heaven.
The man therefore read it, and looking upon Evangelist very carefully said, "Whither must I fly?" Then said Evangelist, "Do you see yonder wicket gate?" The man said, "No." Then said the other, "Do you see yonder shining light?" He said, "I think I do." Then said Evangelist, "Keep that light in your eye, and go up directly thereto. So shalt thou see the gate, at which when thou knockest, it shall be told thee what thou shalt do." So I saw in my dream that the man began to run. Now he had not run far from his own door when his wife and children, perceiving it, began to cry after him to return. But the man put his fingers in his ears and ran on, crying, "Life, life, eternal life!" So he looked not behind him, but fled towards the middle of the plain.
Many of the aspects of the main character's journey of faith came from Bunyan's own personal experience. His faith journey was a lonely one. Bunyan carried the burden of his spirituality alone. Haunted by the knowledge of his sin, he was prepared to make any sacrifice necessary to continue his pursuit of salvation. Bunyan gives his main character a wonderful victory when he encounters the cross, finally releasing him of his heavy, sinful burden.
He ran thus till he came to a place somewhat ascending, and upon that place stood a cross, and a little below in the bottom a tomb. So I saw in my dream that just as Christian came up with the cross, his burden loosed from off his shoulders and fell from off his back, and began to tumble, and so continued to do till it came to the mouth of the tomb, where it fell in, and I saw it no more. Then was Christian glad and lightsome, and said with a merry heart, He hath given me rest by his sorrow, and life by his death. Then he stood still a while, to look and wonder, for it was very surprising to him that the sight of the cross should thus ease him of his burden.
While he was still in prison, the congregation of the Bedford Church voted to make Bunyan their pastor. Religious tolerance was increasing throughout the nation, and by March of 1672, the king issued a pardon for anyone charged with rebelling against the Anglican Church.
Thousands of Protestants were released from prison, amongst them Bunyan and 5 of his fellow inmates. Following his release from jail in 1672, Bunyan devoted his time to writing and preaching. He continued as pastor of the Bedford meeting and traveled over adjoining counties on horseback to preach, becoming known affectionately as Bishop Bunyan.
The Pilgrim's Progress was published in 1678 by Nathaniel Ponder and immediately became a bestseller.
In 1688, on his way to London to preach, Bunyan traveled through a storm and caught a fever. He died this month in history on August 31st, 1688.
Jon Bunyan left behind 2 of the most influential Christian books in history, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners and The Pilgrim's Progress. He was able to capture his own pain and turn it into a work of art. The great beauty of Jon Bunyan's life is like the main character in Pilgrim's Progress, he persevered. Today, we can look back on his life and find the inspiration to persevere in our own spiritual journeys. For the rest of history, Jon Bunyan will be considered in the pantheon of the world's greatest authors. In the book of Exodus, God chose an Israelite by the name of Bezalel from the tribe of Judah. He blessed him with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge to artistically craft the gold and silver, the woodwork, stonework, and precious gems that would adorn the temple, the Old Testament home of God's Spirit on earth. Today, we can only imagine how beautiful these works of art must have been. Much like Bezalel from the book of Exodus, Michelangelo also had a gift from God. Where Bezalel was tasked with building the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle, Michelangelo was commissioned to create some of the most famous works of art, such as the Statue of David and the painting of the Sistine Chapel. Many regard him as one of the greatest artists of all time. Even centuries after his death, his iconic paintings and sculptures lift our souls and inspire us to reach for the divine. Born in 1475, Michelangelo was an Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and poet who exerted an unparalleled influence on the development of art across the world.
A number of Michelangelo's works of painting, sculpture, and architecture rank among the most famous in existence. Of all the artists of the 16th century, he is best documented. Many of his works survive to this day. He sculpted 2 of his best-known works, the Pieta and David, before the age of 30. The Pieta is housed in St. Peter's Basilica, Vatican City. It was commissioned for the French Cardinal Jean de Bélier, who was a representative in Rome. Carved out of Carrara marble, the sculpture was made for the Cardinal's funeral monument, but was moved to its current location, St. Peter's Basilica, in the 18th century. This famous work of art depicts the body of Jesus on the lap of his mother Mary after the crucifixion. Michelangelo's interpretation balances naturalism with the classical style of the Renaissance.
Michelangelo claimed the block of Carrara marble he used to work on was the most perfect block he had ever used, and he would go on to polish and refine his work more than any other statue he created.
The scene of the Pieta shows the Virgin Mary holding the dead body of Christ after his crucifixion, just before he was placed in the tomb. One of the 7 sorrows of Mary, this is one of the key events of her life and the subject of devotional prayers. Michelangelo's talent is obvious in the carving of the drapery and the human forms. Christ and the Virgin both retain a tenderness despite the tragic nature of the scene. Mary's in graceful acceptance. Christ is depicted almost in a peaceful rest, rather than a recent victim of torture. Mary's right hand does not touch Christ's body directly, but is protected by a cloth. This could signify the sacredness of Christ's body. There is an inscription on the diagonal band running over Mary's torso. About this inscription, in a work about the life of Michelangelo, Vasari gives comments. One day, Michelangelo, entering the place where it was set up, found there a great number of strangers from Lombardy who were praising it highly, and one of them asked one of the others who had done it, and he answered, "Our Gobbo from Milan." Michelangelo stood silent, but thought it something strange that his labors should be attributed to another. And one night he shut himself in there, and having brought a little light and his chisels, carved his name upon it.
This was the only work of Michelangelo to which he signed his name. Vasari also reports the anecdote that Michelangelo later regretted his outburst of pride and swore never to sign another work of his hands. St. Peter's Basilica is a church located in Vatican City within the city of Rome. Michelangelo was one of the principal designers of this hallowed place. St. Peter's is the most renowned work of Renaissance architecture and the largest church in the world. It is considered one of the holiest Catholic sites, and by many people of faith, the greatest of all churches in Christendom.
According to Catholic tradition, the basilica is the burial site of St. Peter, one of Jesus' apostles, and also the first bishop of Rome. St. Peter's tomb is supposedly directly below the high altar of the basilica. A church has stood on the site since the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. Old St. Peter's Basilica dates from the 4th century AD, and construction of the present basilica began on April 18, 1506, and was completed on November 18, 1626.
St. Peter's is a famous place of pilgrimage for Christians all over the world. The Pope attends a number of services throughout the year, both within the basilica or at the adjoining St. Peter's Square. These services draw audience numbering from 15 to 80,000 people. St. Peter's has many historical associations with the early Christian church, the papacy, the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and numerous artists, especially Michelangelo. As a work of architecture, it's regarded as the greatest building of its age, and many would argue the greatest building of all time. To Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel ceiling was far from the grandiose accomplishment as we see it now. It caused him personal turmoil, and he was grateful when the enormous task was finally completed.
The Sistine Chapel is a large papal chapel built within the Vatican between 1477 and 1480 by Pope Sixtus IV, who the chapel is named after. The ceiling was painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512 at the commission of Pope Julius II. When you enter the chapel, you can't help but look heavenward with deep awe. In the center of the ceiling decoration are 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, the creation of Adam being the most popular. As you gaze upward, marveling at Michelangelo's creation, he reminds you of God's creation. The task of painting the ceiling placed Michelangelo under tremendous strain. He wrote to his father in Florence, "I lead a miserable existence. I live wearied by stupendous labors and beset by 1,000 anxieties. And thus I have lived for some 15 years now, and never an hour's happiness have I had." At the end of his commissioning, he wrote very simply, "I have finished the chapel I have been painting."
Arguably the most famous sculpture in the world, Michelangelo's David was sculpted over the course of 3 years, beginning when the artist was just 26 years old. Most depictions of the era show David post-battle, triumphant over Goliath's severed head. But Michelangelo revealed David in an almost casual position just before the fight. David was a man of supreme confidence in God, and his casual lean suggests that he wasn't even concerned about the fight at all.
And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." The sling is barely visible and not the focal point of the piece, possibly suggesting that the fight was not about weapons. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied."
So it could be argued that Michelangelo depicted David closer to his character than any other depiction. Because David was not the greatest warrior, although he was great, the characteristic that set David apart was his supreme trust in God and gave him the confidence on the battlefield. David trusted God and was deeply devoted to him.
He raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, "I have found in David the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will."
And these are just a handful of the masterpieces for which Michelangelo is best known. But did you know that Michelangelo also wrote poetry? His writings reveal a bit more about the personal faith of this brilliant man. In fact, we can see that toward the end of his life, his faith seemed to deepen. In his own words,
"Neither painting nor sculpture will be able any longer to calm my soul, now turned toward that divine love that opened his arms on the cross to take us in."
Much like himself, Michelangelo's works reveal a humanity that is both glorious and deeply flawed, tortured and peaceful. Germany, 1941. During the reign of Hitler's Nazi Party, a wholesaler and salesman of herbs and spices by the name of Otto relocated his family to Amsterdam. When German forces occupied the Netherlands, his two daughters transferred from a public school to a Jewish one in hopes of finding a safer environment. But sadly, this was only the beginning of their trials. In 1942, one of Otto's daughters began writing in the red and white plaid diary she received on her 13th birthday. In her words,
"I hope I will be able to confide everything to you, as I have never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you will be a great source of comfort and support."
Little did this early teenage girl know that she would become one of the world's most celebrated authors. Her diary is known to us today as the Diary of Anne Frank, and her writings have inspired the faith of generations.
When Anne's sister Margot was summoned to report to forced labor camp in July of 1942, the Frank family went into hiding in the back office of Otto Frank's business. With the aid of a few non-Jewish friends who smuggled in food and other supplies, the Frank family and 4 other Jews lived confined to the secret annex. During this time, Anne wrote regularly in her diary, recounting day-to-day life in hiding, from ordinary annoyances to the fear of capture. She discussed typical adolescent issues, as well as her hopes for the future, which included becoming a journalist or a writer.
Hiding from an enemy who is actively hunting you down hardly seems like the ideal environment to begin a writing career. But as we'll come to find, this wasn't something that Anne needed to do for herself, but something she needed to do for the rest of the world. Much like David being pursued by Saul, Anne Frank's writings were serving more than just her.
"See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me for no offense or sin of mine, Lord. I have done no wrong, yet they are ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight."
Otto Frank stopped running his business while his family was in hiding. But on his return, he found his employees running it on their own. The rooms that everyone hid in were concealed behind a movable bookcase. With the assistance of friends, the Franks remained hidden for 2 years.
Anne's diary is not written to herself like many classical diary entries. Instead, addresses her diary as Kitty. During the war, an exiled minister of education sent a message through radio broadcast for all to preserve as much ordinary documents, diaries, letters, simple everyday materials to create an archive as testimony to the suffering of civilians during the Nazi occupation. After this broadcast, Anne redrafted her diary thinking of distribution to future readers. She expanded certain entries and clarified certain situations that may not be understood by strangers. She instituted pseudonyms for the sake of her character's anonymity and cut certain scenes that were too intimate for the public. One thing she kept was Kitty, addressing all her entries to the name.
The diary was found written on loose sheets of paper strewn on the floor of the hiding place. This was after the family's arrest, but before the rooms were ransacked by the Dutch police and the Gestapo. The writings were kept safe and given to Otto Frank after the war, when Anne's death was confirmed in the spring of 1945. The purpose of her diary became clear in her written introduction. She desired to have one person that she could call her truest friend, someone that she could confide her deepest thoughts and feelings. She shared that she was rich with friends and she had many admirers, but she longed for that one true friend that she could share her most innermost thoughts.
There are two versions of the diary. Version A was written in a diary and 2 notebooks. But after hearing the radio broadcast announcing the desire for wartime diaries to document the period, she rewrote it on loose paper, creating version B, editing it to be read by a wide audience. Anne spent most of her free time reading and studying, and she regularly wrote and rewrote her diary entries, especially after the radio broadcast. She wrote about events as they were occurring, a wonderful perspective of the war, but she also wrote about her personal feelings, beliefs, and ambitions. Anne wrote,
I finally realized that I must do my schoolwork to keep from being ignorant, to get on in life, to become a journalist, because that's what I want. I know I can write, but it remains to be seen whether I really have talent. And if I don't have the talent to write books or newspaper articles, I can always write for myself. But I want to achieve more than that. I need to have something besides a husband and children to devote myself to. I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living after my death. And that's why I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and to express all that's inside me.
And eventually dove into the subject of God.
The best remedy for those who are afraid, lonely, or unhappy is to go outside, somewhere where they can be quite alone with the heavens, nature, and God. Because only then does one feel that all is as it should be, and that God wishes to see people happy amidst the simple beauty of nature. As long as this exists, and it certainly always will, I know that then there will always be comfort for every sorrow, whatever the circumstances may be, and I firmly believe that nature brings solace in all troubles.
SS officer Karl Silberbauer of the Nazi intelligence, along with the attachment of German police, stormed the annex on the morning of August 4th, 1944. The families were interrogated and held overnight until they were transferred to the House of Detention. After 2 days, they were transferred to the Westerbork transit camp, where they were assigned to hard labor in the punishment barracks.
On September 3, 1944, the group was deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp and arrived after a 3-day journey. Accompanying them on the train was Blome Evers Emden, a friend of Margot and Anne. Blome saw Anne, Margot, and their mother regularly in Auschwitz and was interviewed on documentaries accounting her time with the Frank women in Auschwitz. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, Otto Frank was separated from his family due to the SS forcibly splitting the men from the women and children. They would deem some able to work, and they were admitted into the camp, and those deemed unfit for labor were immediately killed. Of the 1,019 passengers, 549, including all children younger than 15, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Anne Frank, who had turned 15 3 months earlier, was one of the youngest people spared from her transport. She was soon made aware that most people were gassed upon arrival and never learned that the entire group from the annex had survived this selection. She reasoned that her father, in his mid-50s and not particularly robust, had been killed immediately after they were separated. Along with the other girls spared from this round of killings, Anne was forced into slave labor in the Auschwitz concentration camp. During the night, they slept in overcrowded barracks and fought against sickness and hunger rampant in the camp. Selections began for women to be relocated to Bergen-Belsen. More than 8,000 women, including Anne and Margot Frank, and August Van Pels, were transported. Edith Frank was left behind and died of starvation. Witnesses later testified her sister Margot fell from her bunk in her weakened state of typhus and was killed by the shock. Anne died 1 day later. The exact date of Anne's death is unknown.
Otto Frank, Anne's father, had survived Auschwitz. After the war ended, he returned to Amsterdam in June of 1945, where he attempted to locate his family. After several weeks, he discovered his wife and his 2 daughters had all perished in the Nazi concentration camp.
In July 1945, after the Red Cross confirmed the deaths of the Frank sisters, a friend gave Otto Frank the diary and a bundle of loose notes that she had saved in the hope of returning them to Anne. Otto Frank later commented that he had not realized Anne had kept such an accurate and well-written record of their time in hiding. In his memoir, he described the painful process of reading the diary, recognizing the events described and recalling that he had already heard some of the more amusing episodes read aloud by his daughter.
Otto Frank, for the first time, saw the more private side of his daughter and those sections of the diary that she didn't discuss with anyone, noting, "For me, it was a revelation. I had no idea of the depth of her thoughts and feelings. She had kept all of these feelings to herself." Moved by her repeated wish to be an author, he decided to have it published. After being rejected by several publishers, it was first published in the United Kingdom in 1952. The first American edition was also published in 1952, under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl.
Simon Wiesenthal said that the diary had raised more widespread awareness of the Holocaust than had been achieved during the Nuremberg trials, because people identified with his child. This was the impact of the Holocaust. This was a family like my family, like your family, and so you could understand this. In June 1999, Time magazine published a special edition titled Time 100, The Most Important People of the Century. Anne Frank was selected as one of the heroes and icons. The magazine described her legacy with the comment, "The passions the book ignites suggest that everyone owns Anne Frank, that she has risen above the Holocaust, Judaism, girlhood, and even goodness and become a totemic figure of the modern world. The moral individual mind beset by the machinery of destruction, insisting on the right to live and question and hope for the future of human beings."
Anne Frank's diary represents much more than just the diary of a teenage girl. She's an important historical and cultural figure who represented the destruction of youth during the war. We mourn the loss of what she could have become with such a great talent and strong ambition. But by Anne's own words, she found a way to fulfill her dreams, even with only 15 short years on this earth. Remember what Anne wrote: "I want to be useful or bring enjoyment to all people, even those I've never met. I want to go on living even after my death." And that's what I'm so grateful to God for having given me this gift, which I can use to develop myself and express all that's inside me. Anne didn't wish for a long life, but for a significant life. She wanted to make an impact with her writing, and by the grace of God, she did. May we do the same with the time we've been given. In the book of Hebrews, the Apostle Paul tells us to run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Of course, for most of us, Paul isn't encouraging us to run an actual race. But for Jesse Owens, that's exactly what this passage meant. This month in history, in August 1936, Nazi soldiers lined the streets in Berlin welcoming Olympic athletes from around the world. Some of those athletes they deemed unfit to compete in their Olympic Games. But Jesse Owens, a Black American, stood on German soil as the United States' best representative to win the gold and upset Hitler's Aryan ideology. By Hitler's definition, Jesse Owens wasn't human. And maybe Hitler was right. Maybe Jesse Owens was superhuman. His athletic achievements were already legendary.
During the 1935 Big Ten track meet in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Owens set 3 world records and tied 1 more, all in less than an hour. It's considered the greatest 45 minutes in sports history. Breaking 4 world records in a 70-minute span had put a target on the back of the Alabama native. Originally known as JC, Owens was born in Oakville, Alabama in 1913. He was one of 10 children and the grandson of a former slave. As a kid, Jesse said that he was simply faster than all of his friends. At school, he was encouraged to take advantage of his natural talent and join the track team. Jesse first shocked the onlookers with his speed at the 1933 National High School Championships. He tied the world record in the 100-yard dash at 9.4 seconds. And when he went to college, he didn't slow down. As a part of the Ohio State University track team, he would soon win 8 individual NCAA championships, earning him the name the Buckeye Bullet.
Though Owens enjoyed athletic success, he had to live off campus with other African-American athletes. When he traveled with the team, Owens was restricted to eating at blacks-only restaurants. He had to stay at blacks-only hotels. Even though he was the greatest track athlete in the nation, because of his skin color, Owens did not receive a scholarship. In fact, he had to work part-time jobs to pay for his school.
Owens achieved track and field immortality in a span of 45 minutes on May 25, 1935, during the Big Ten meet in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He equaled the world record for the 100-yard dash and set world records in the long jump, 220-yard sprint, and 220 low hurdles. It's considered one of the greatest athletic achievements in history. In 1936, Owens and his United States teammates sailed on the SS Manhattan and arrived in Germany to compete.
At the Olympic Stadium in Berlin, his fame preceded him. Crowds of German fans cheered, "Where is Jesse?" Just before the competitions, founder of Adidas athletic shoe company, Adi Dassler, visited Owens at the Olympic Village and persuaded him to wear the company's shoes. This was the first sponsorship for a male African-American athlete ever.
Much to Hitler's dismay, Owens won the 100-meter dash with a time of 10.3 seconds. He won the 200-meter sprint with a time of 20.7 seconds, as well as the long jump with a leap of 8.06 meters, or 26 feet 5 inches. He would also win the 4x100-meter relay and capture a record 4 gold medals, and was not equaled until Carl Lewis won gold medals in the same events at the 1984 Summer Olympics. He would later credit his long jump world record to advice that he gained from Luz Long, the German competitor whom he defeated. Luz would become a friend, and Owens would eventually have a spiritual impact on the German. On August 1st, 1936, Nazi Germany's leader Adolf Hitler shook hands with the German victors only, and then left the stadium. International Olympic Committee President Henri de Bailly-Latour insisted that Hitler greet every medalist or none at all. Hitler opted for the latter and skipped all further medal presentations.
Hitler was subsequently accused of failing to acknowledge Owens or shake his hand, a common misconception. Even Hitler could not ignore his athletic greatness. Owens once said,
Hitler had a certain time to come to the stadium and a certain time to leave. It happened that he had to leave before the victory ceremony after the 100 meters race began at 5:45 p.m. But before he left, I was on my way to a broadcast and passed near his box. He waved at me, and I waved back. In an article dated August 4th, 1936, the African-American newspaper editor Robert L. Vann describes witnessing Hitler salute Owens for having won gold in the 100-meter sprint. And then, wonder of wonders, I saw Herr Adolf Hitler salute this lad. I looked on with a heart which beat proudly as the lad who was crowned king of the 100 meters event get an ovation the like of which I have never heard before.
Many athletes around the world were inspired by Owens.
During a parade in New York City in his honor, Owens was handed a paper bag. Owens paid it little mind until the parade concluded. When he opened it up, he found the bag contained $10,000 in cash.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt never invited Jesse Owens to the White House following his triumphs at the Olympic Games. When the Democrats bid for his support, Owens rejected their overtures. As a staunch Republican, he endorsed Alf Landon, Roosevelt's Republican opponent in the 1936 presidential race.
Speaking at a Republican rally in Baltimore, Owens said, "Some people say Hitler snubbed me, but I tell you Hitler did not snub me. I'm not knocking the president. Remember, I am not a politician, but remember that the president did not send me a message of congratulations because people said he was too busy."
Owens decided to capitalize on his success by taking advantage of endorsement deals. United States athletic officials did not like this. They withdrew his amateur status, which had the effect of ending his career immediately. Owens returned home from the 1936 Olympics with 4 gold medals and international fame, yet had difficulty finding work. He had to take on menial jobs as a gas station attendant, playground janitor, and a manager of a dry cleaner. He also raced against amateurs for cash. Owens was prohibited from making appearances at amateur sporting events, and his commercial offers were nearly dried up.
In 1937, he briefly toured with a 12-piece jazz band under contract with Consolidated Artists. He made appearances at baseball games and other events until Willis Ward, a friend and former competitor, brought Owens to Detroit in 1942 to work for the Ford Motor Company as assistant personnel director. But as Jesse's athletic abilities faded, his faith did not.
You see, Jesse's gifts weren't just on the field of competition, but in his ability to share his faith with his athletic opponents. One account from the German long jumper Luz Long, whom Jesse defeated that August for the gold medal, tells of how Jesse's testimony changed his life. In a letter written by Luz Long, the German who gave advice to Owens while they were competing, talks about his newfound faith because of Owens' influence. The letter has profound significance due to the circumstances of its writing. During his time serving in World War II for the Nazis, Luz wrote Jesse,
"I am here, Jesse, where it seems there is only the dry sand and the wet blood. I do not fear so much for myself, my friend Jesse. I fear for my woman who is home, and my young son Carl, who has never really known his father. My heart tells me, if I be honest with you, that this is the last letter I shall ever write. If it is so, I ask you something. It is a something so very important to me. It is you go to Germany when this war is done. Someday find my Carl and tell him about his father. Tell him, Jesse, what times were like when we were not separated by war. I am saying, tell him how things can be between men on this earth. If you do this something for me, this thing that I need the most to know will be done. I do something for you now. I tell you something I know you want to hear, and it is true. That hour in Berlin when I first spoke to you, when you had your knee upon the ground, I knew that you were in prayer. Then I not know how I know, but now I do. I know it is never by chance that we come together. I come to you that hour in 1936 for purpose more than der Berliner Olympiade. And you, I believe, will read this letter while it should not be possible to reach you ever, for purpose more even than our friendship. I believe this shall come about because I think now that God will make it come about. This is what I have to tell you, Jesse. I think I might believe in God. And I pray to him that even while it should not be possible for this to reach you ever, these words I write will still be read by you, your brother, Luz.
Luz was killed in action soon after in July of 1943. The letter reached Owens a year after it was sent. Jesse kept his promise to his friend. After the war, Owens traveled to Germany to meet Luz's son, Carl. He was a part of Carl's life and even served as his best man at his wedding.
Owens traveled the world and spoke to companies such as the Ford Motor Company and stakeholders such as the United States Olympic Committee.
In 1979, he was hospitalized with lung cancer. He died of the disease at age 66 in Tucson, Arizona on March 31st, 1980. Although Jimmy Carter had ignored Owens' request to cancel the Olympic boycott in Moscow, the president issued a tribute to Owens after he died. Perhaps no athlete better symbolized the human struggle against tyranny, poverty, and racial bigotry. Owens demonstrated how believers can answer the Apostle Paul's charge to hate what is evil and be devoted to one another in love. Those hot summer days in August, Jesse Owens could have responded to the evil around him with hate. Instead, Owens chose to live by faith and show love to a man who would later become his friend and eventually consider belief in God. Jon Bunyan, Michelangelo, Anne Frank, and Jesse Owens. Some famous during their own lives and some long after their deaths. Though most never boasted of a career in ministry, their influence is undeniable. And a reminder to us all, in whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God, the Father, through him. Colossians 3:17. I hope you've enjoyed looking back at what happened this month in Christian history. What I love about studying the past is that one moment in time can open up loads of incredible history. No matter how much life we've lived, we can all learn so much from the believers that have gone before us. The peaks and valleys that they endured can prepare us to pioneer our own paths. But most of all, they can inspire us to trust in the God who holds all of history in his hands. I'm Cody Crouch. I hope you'll join me next time on This Month in Christian History. Until then, go make some history of your own.